Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Microsoft Research's Race and Technology Lecture Series. In this series, we've brought together some of the most important scholars working at the intersection of race studies and technology studies to address the many ways these domains intersect in computer science, public health, digital media, gaming, surveillance, which we'll hear more about today, and other domains. If you've been with us before, for the lectures that we've been hosting these last few months, you've already seen how important it is to understand how technology and race construct one another if we're going to build inclusive technologies that empower us all. And if you've missed any of the first 5 lectures, they're available on our YouTube channel. I want to thank Hannah Wallach, Charlton McElwain, Christopher Morris, and Eleanor Buxton for co-organizing the series, and I want to thank all of you for helping us achieve its aims. If you have been with us before, you've also heard me acknowledge that these topics are fraught and their discussion can be unsettling. Talking about power is rarely easy. The audiences for these lectures have ranged from experts to people getting their first exposure to these topics, and we're striving to create an environment in which all of you can ask the questions that this talk provokes for you. I will be monitoring questions in the Q&A, and I encourage you to pose them as they arise. And we have about 20 minutes for live Q&A after the talk. Today, we are so fortunate to hear from Dr. Simone Browne. I'm super excited for this talk. Dr. Browne is an associate professor of African and African Diaspora Studies at the University of Texas at Austin, where she is also research director of Critical Surveillance Inquiry, CSI, with Good Systems. CSI works with scholars, organizations, and communities to curate conversations, exhibitions, and research that examine the social and ethical implications of surveillance technologies, both with and without AI. With a focus on algorithmic harm and tech equity, they continually question what's good in order to better understand the development and impact of artificial intelligence. Her first book, Dark Matters on the Surveillance of Blackness, won awards in American Studies, Surveillance Studies, and Communication and Technology Studies. And her second book, Like the Mixture of Charcoal and Darkness, is in progress, and it's going to examine the interventions made by artists whose works grapple with the surveillance of Black life. Together, the essays are going to explore the productive possibilities of creative innovation when it comes to troubling surveillance and its various tactics, and imagining Black life beyond the surveillance state. Today, she'll be sharing from Today, she'll be sharing from that work with her talk entitled Acrylic, Metal, Blue, and a Means of Preparation, Imagining and Living Black Life Beyond the Surveillance State. Please join me in welcoming, and please put your questions in the chat. Thank you.
Thank you to everyone at Microsoft's Race and Technology Lecture Series to put the work into producing this event, and a special thank you to Charlton McElwain for the invitation to be a part of this series. So, one beginning. During my graduate studies, I was interested in post-September 11th security measures around identification, specifically biometric technologies. And I researched those technologies through transcripts of debates in the Canadian Parliament and documents released to me through the Access to Information Act. This led me to such zingers as the Minister of Citizenship and Immigration stating, "I believe that biometrics doesn't have a race. It doesn't have a religion. We won't look at the color of the skin. We just want to know mathematically if the thumbprint fits." And in October 2001, when the Canadian government announced its chip-ready permanent resident card at a press conference at Niagara Falls, the Minister of Citizenship and Immigration held up a prototype of the card, and on it was a picture of what seemed to be a white woman with the country code LKA for Sri Lanka, and with a Tamil last name. A couple years after that, it was reported that the Canadian government was considering biometrics for Indian status cards. It is interesting, but not surprising, to note here that Indigenous populations were among the original targets of containment and the regulation of mobility by way of the pass system instituted with Canada's 1876 Indian Act. That they could also be among the first populations to be subjected to biometric identification trials. In this way, the digitizing of Indigenous nations by the Canadian state at that time forms part of the continuing fashioning of the white settler states through its attempts at governing Indigenous identities and mobilities. So if biometrics doesn't have a race, like the Citizenship and Immigration Minister put it, and the Canadian state just wants to know mathematically if the thumbprint fits, then my question was, why was this, at the time newish technology, being trialed to seemingly track immigrants and Indigenous people? I was interested in how categories of people get casted as risk, as security threat, and rendered as that which the state seeks protection from, and as the reason why consent for these technologies is gained. This is in keeping with what Ursula Franklin has termed the real world of, in the real world of technology, the credible enemy. She says that the state has to guarantee the ongoing long-term presence of a credible enemy because only a credible enemy justifies the massive outlay of public funds for arms and for securitization. But in doing this dissertation work, I was unsettled by what seemed to be at the time an absence within the field of surveillance studies of the fact of surveillance in Black people's lives. So later, when I set out to do research that would eventually become my first book, I wanted to make an intervention in what I saw, at least at the time, as the under-theorization of race within surveillance studies. I did this by asking, and I've said this numerous times, how a realization of the conditions of surveillance of Black life, that being the historical, the present, and the historical present, can help social theorists understand our contemporary conditions of surveillance. So rather than seeing surveillance as something that gets put into place or inaugurated with new technologies such as backscatter machines at airports or remote warfare by way of drones, I wanted to see surveillance as something that's ongoing, and by looking at its precursive formations, in order to insist that we factor in how racism, and particularly how anti-Blackness, shape our present governing order in what is now the United States and beyond that nation's borders. It was an attempt to ask of a field of study the question of what happens when Blackness enters the frame, as Desi Cryer put it in his now viral HP Computers Are Racist video. In other words, instead of looking at Jeremy Bentham's design of the panopticon, we must also take into account what Bentham wrote when he traveled aboard a slave ship. Or in order to better understand the workings of power as outlined by Michel Foucault through his account of the execution of the regicide, that we should pair that account with plantation management and punishment practices, lantern laws, the branding of enslaved people as early formations of biometric technologies, along with the archive of resistance and revolts. Lantern laws, runaway notices, biometric technologies, and identification by way of branding all played a key role in the historical formation of surveillance. But what this archive also reveals are modes of refusal and rebellion, moves that were ingenious and inventive, that demonstrate an experiential insight of methods of surveillance in order to trouble, to resist, and to undo them. One thing that didn't make it into that book was a discussion of a patent issued in 1969 to Mary and Albert Van Britten Browne for an audio-video alarm system for household protection. It was designed to include a video scanning device at the door's entrance, an intercom, an alarm, audio recording capabilities, and a front door video scanner. It also had a bolt that could be unlocked by way of remote control. So this closed-circuit television system is obviously a precursor to contemporary remote home monitoring systems for the consumer market, like video doorbells. Mary Van Britten Browne was a nurse, and I wanted to imagine that she came up with the idea for this device while talking to other nurses who worked the night shift with her. I wanted to think that they thought of this technology as a strategy for self-defense, another option instead of calling the cops. And just maybe that this device spoke to an earlier iteration of what Lisa Nakamura in her talk in this series termed anti-carceral data collection. Just maybe. It seemed to me at the time that there was a certain absenting of this invention in the official genealogy of surveillance technologies, sort of like the generalized absenting of Black women's contributions when it comes to the ways that surveillance is conceptualized and historicized. And I wondered if in any way our relationship to and knowledge about security, surveillance, and its infrastructures could be altered by remembering that in the late 1960s, a Black woman from Queens, New York, had a patented role in the development of closed-circuit television. However, Mary Van Braune's 1969 patent was recently referenced in a patent granted to Amazon Technologies this past summer. It was for a USB audiovisual doorbell dongle. While I once might have tried to see our invention as a response to a legitimate fear of racist police violence, to see this Black woman's invention cited by Amazon points to how even if it was such an effort, a response to anti-Black police violence, how easily it can be incorporated into the genealogy of Ring surveillance hardware. This is concerning because, as we know, Amazon has partnered with policing agencies to share footage from its Ring doorbell users, as well as users of the accompanying Neighbors app can receive in-application notifications or alerts when police make requests for their videos. Amazon only recently introduced opt-in end-to-end encryption feature for their Ring video footage. But this means that only if users choose to opt in to this video encryption feature would their Ring footage be excluded from video sharing requests by the police. I later turned to a different archive to think about biometric technologies, one held in Austin, Texas. Woodrow Wilson, Woody Bledsoe, would come to be known as one of the earliest researchers in artificial intelligence and facial recognition technology. He was a mathematics and computer science professor at the University of Texas, and when he died, he left his papers to be archived there. Not all of his works are there, as he was said to have burned some of his records shortly before his death in 1995. In 1982, Woody Bledsoe was contacted by a defense attorney from California who sought his assistance as a forensic expert in a robbery case. The attorney provided Bledsoe with a series of bank surveillance photos, as well as photos of his client as he appeared at the time of his arrest and preliminary examination. The bank surveillance photos were of low quality and gritty, with key features obscured, like the eyes hidden behind sunglasses, and the ears being covered by a hat. Therefore, it was hard for Woody Bledsoe to determine the tilt and rotation angles of the face, so he was unable to apply his facial recognition program to assess interpupillar distance. Instead, Bledsoe performed these calculations by hand, noting that, quote, "We cannot expect to prove that the defendant is the robber, but we might be able to show that he is not." Bledsoe made some assumptions around this particular case, one being that the access of the bank's cameras was unknown. I want to gesture to his list of assumptions to point out that when it comes to facial recognition technology by way of executable computer code, some important questions to this day still remain. Namely, what constitutes the face in facial recognition? Does the face include cutaneous biometrics through which pattern recognition could be used to assess identity by way of scars, pores, wrinkles, moles, tattoos, and other facial markings? Does it include that which stems from the face, like a fallen eyelash or morning breath? What about vein visualization apps that make use of infrared cameras? And what about effective computing technologies where emotion detection on a live face is used to supposedly machine read emotions at an airport, or monitor travelers for blood pressure, for sweat or fever, body heat, or changes in their voices, and then assigning a threat category or score to them? These kind of effective computing technologies heighten the role of affect, which, as we know, is something that is socially constructed. This should get us to think about who gets marked as angry and who gets marked as innocent prior to any reaction. When it comes to the question of what constitutes the face in facial recognition technology, we must also account for long distance and non-cooperative iris capture, ear pattern recognition, tattoo recognition, remote measurements of respiration rates by way of infrared sensors, automated race estimations, and the production of composite profiles like Parabon Labs snapshot DNA phenotyping that makes a specious claim to accurately predict genetic ancestry, eye, hair, and skin color, and face shape of an unknown person from found DNA. found DNA like on a used and discarded coffee cup or a piece of chewing gum that someone might find on the sidewalk. In one case in March 2017, the Brockton, Massachusetts Police Department held a press conference where it stated that the police had used Parabon's DNA phenotyping services to produce a mugshot-looking phenotype report of a suspect in a cold case using DNA samples found on the victims' bodies. The mugshot came with a map of Africa, with parts of the continent's west coast shaded in red, and where the suspect was said to be some 28% European, 57% West African, and 10% Middle East and North African. So in this moment of pauses, temporary bans, and the Facial Recognition and Biometric Technology Moratorium Act of 2021, which is now with the Committee on the Judiciary, we have the opportunity for a more expansive definition of the face to be predictive when it comes to things like high-powered infrared being used to possibly, in some near future, measure vascular patterns in the human face. We need to do this before the toothpaste can no longer be put back in the tube, so to speak. But back to Bledsoe. One challenge that he saw in this particular case of the bank robber was what he termed the problem of the wider nose. It seemed that the image of the robber captured by CCTV had a wider looking nose by about 20% than that of the lawyer's client, according to Bledsoe's hand calculations. He could not account for this unless the bank robber's nose was somehow distorted by way of disguise, and Bledsoe admitted that he was no expert in disguise. His experiments and calculations included using a boxer's mouth guard and stuffing his cheeks with cotton to see if mathematically he could make the nose fit. In his notes, he suggested that other than the wider looking nose, the lawyer's client looks a lot like the suspect, and that he felt helpless working with so little. Throughout his notes, there's a tentativeness at times. He writes that another picture might help and questions, where are the cameras in the bank? And he posits that even with his most careful and conservative measurements still give the robber a wider nose. Importantly, he asks himself, should I continue? Should I continue is a question that we should all be asking on matters of surveillance, facial recognition technology, and other artificial intelligence. Much earlier in 1965, Bledsoe wrote to the DoD proposing to study the idea of whether racial background could be culled from facial photographs. Other than this correspondence, one could easily surmise that there's little reference to race in Bledsoe's work or in his archive. But race is all around in terms of a prototypical whiteness surrounding whose faces are studied and measured, mainly the pictures of the white male students whose bodies and facial features served as the model for his research. Many of the pictures in the archive are blurred from overexposure in the capture process. Prototypical whiteness still continues to inform the technocultural logic of biometric identification, verification, and automation technologies in its development and in its application. By design, prototypical whiteness, and by extension, prototypical maleness, prototypical youthfulness, prototypical able-bodiedness, etc., undergirds certain assumptions regarding the human body once it's made into data and applied to surveillance technologies like face recognition systems and iris and gait analysis. Biometric technologies rely on a truth claim that the body will produce a certain truth about a person's identity, regardless of what identity that person claims. As we know, this design can only work when it relies on the notion that these technologies are infallible, objective, and have a mathematical precision without error or bias on the part of the computer programmers who create data sets and calibrate search parameters, and analysts who make decisions based on these calculations. And crucial to prototypical whiteness when it comes to biometric technologies is a deliberate absenting of its historical and historically present antecedents. that being anthropometry, nasal physiognomy, and cop speak of wider set noses, phrenology, polygenism, psychometrics, and the et ceteras of scientific racism. This historical precedent is constitutive of its current order. Of course, not everyone falls for this alibi of technological infallibility, and we can turn to the work of the Algorithmic Justice League and the We Won't Build It movement for examples. Or people who take to Twitter to protest when a touchless hand sanitizer dispenser won't work for them, but works for someone with paler appearing hands. Or a test proctoring surveillance software that charges them with cheating for non-detection of their face. Or a pulse oximeter that gives me a false reading because of the amount of melanin that's said to be in my nail bed, or the dark nail polish making me unmeasurable and unable to register by design. It exceeds calculation. Exceeding calculation, like the blurred composite portraits that make up artist Dennis Delgado's dark database. With this creative work, he troubles the very methodologies of facial recognition by using OpenCV algorithm on motion picture films like Do the Right Thing and Training Day to make some composite semblance of a face that is unrecognizable. It's blurred, but it's a blurring technology unlike that which Google applies to blur identifiable faces and license plate imagery that are published to Google Maps Street View. An anonymization process that company says can't be reversed, and that it assumes quite a lot about the face in assigning it primacy over the rest of the body when it comes to identification on Street View. Instead, Delgado's blurring asks us to think about that which can't be captured by facial recognition, and asks us to think about the spectral of ghosts and, as he put it, the trace of a past colonial crime. The past colonial crime is still present, or at least it rhymes, by mirroring earlier pseudoscientific racist and sexist discourse that sought to define racial and gendered categories and order humans in a linear fashion to regulate those artificial boundaries that could never be fully maintained, like mustard seed-filled skulls in Crania Americana, like indexing the human body via Bertillonage, like not in Gideon's Types of Mankind, and like the displaying of Otabenga in the Monkey House of Bronx Zoo in 1906. I count Delgado's dark database as an example of disruption, refusal, and a critical biometric consciousness that seems to provide one answer to Woody Bledsoe's question of should I continue. Last year in the journal Synthesis, poet and novelist M. Norbesi Philip wrote Notes Towards Sealing Forensic Landscapes. In it, she recounts that when she first visited Africa, that she took with her a metal seal embosser that she would use when she was still a practicing attorney to emboss her seal on affidavits after swearing documents. She writes in these Notes Towards Sealing Forensic Landscapes, quote, I carried that machine with me because I wanted to prove something had happened, that my ancestors had been kidnapped and sold away from this continent I was about to visit, end quote. In this essay, Phillips tells us, quote, that we in the Americas live in forensic landscapes, and we also inhabit the scene of the crime, where evidence is erased and destroyed, end a series of quotes. I think of Philip's words when I look back at the images that I took in 2019 when I traveled to Agbogbloshie in Accra, Ghana. I was interested in the work of self-taught computer engineers and makers who were repairing and building from secondhand consumer electronic equipment. Taking the infrastructure of cloud computing, biometrics, smart cities, artificial intelligence, and the processing and storage that those things entail as a starting point, particularly when much of the cloud service and the attendant data storage equipment that accompany these technologies are said to have an average lifespan of only a few years. What happens when this technology becomes obsolete but not useless? Agbogbloshie is part market, part electronic waste site, homes to schools and other businesses, residential area with a population of approximately 50,000 people. It is thought by some to be more toxic than Chernobyl, Ukraine. Emnor Borsi-Philip also wrote, quote, "The undersea cables, the mining projects that exploit people, the sweatshops employing low-wage workers, all creating this algorithmic landscape. That, too, is a forensic landscape of sorts. Special tools are necessary to read the silences of the archive, and these tools, to quote Audre Lorde, cannot be the masters," end quote. On the outskirts of Aglabloshe, this algorithmic landscape, one of the first things that struck me is this image here on the left. It's of a shore banker forecasting the number 57 for the national lottery that week. It is the number that this shore banker wants his patrons to bank their hopes and dreams on. The desk, the numbers, and the chalkboard are special tools of this trade in the futures market of the lottery, advertising his forecasting skills. One of the questions that frame my interest in the problem of electronic waste work is this: what happens when Alexa goes to a craw? This is to say that there can be no big data, artificial intelligence, Ring doorbells, machine learning, or voice control digital assistants like Alexa and Siri without the materials and the hardware that make up its hardware and its infrastructure. And you can think here of Kate Crawford and Vladimir Joler's Anatomy of an AI System that map the life cycle of Amazon Echo through the lens of extraction. Labor extraction, data extraction, and the extraction of our other planetary resources. Or the work of Nicole Starosilski on undersea cables and what she calls the turbulent ecologies of coastal environments where these cables land. Or Ingrid Burrington's mapping of submarine cables tapped by British spy agency GCHQ based on the documents leaked by Edward Snowden. We have to situate questions of accountability and our own complicity when it comes to the health effects of the people that do the loosely regulated or unregulated waste work when it comes to dismantling, sorting, dealing in scraps, burning, and sometimes repairing electronics like laptops, desktops, game consoles, and cell phones. Waste here being the secondhand consumer electrics and electronics equipment market that is imported to sites in Africa, China, and elsewhere at the end of life stage or nearly non-functional from Europe, the UK, North America. While some of the near end-to-life products can be reused or refurbished, the notion of repair seems to be an alibi for these products being imported, where the goal is recycling for copper, aluminum, rare earth minerals, and other materials made raw, once again, to be exported out of the country to make new devices. I met a researcher there who told the story of a cargo of bicycles that was coming from the UK, and when they opened it, it was just end-of-life computer laptops. So cell phones, televisions, small and large appliances like microwaves and refrigerators, cars and motorcycle parts, TVs, computer hard drives, are all make part of this. Anything with available copper, trace amounts of gold, platinum, and other elements make up part of this electronic market. The U.S. Government and Accountability Office released a report last year that found that cell phones contain more precious metals by weight than raw ore, and made the claim that 1 million recycled cell phones can be rendered into 35,274 pounds of copper, 772 pounds of silver, and 75 pounds of gold. So the outcomes of this kind of waste work include toxic exposure to elements such as lead, mercury, plastics, copper, arsenic, soil and drinking water pollution, livestock and food supply contamination, headaches, burns, blurred visions, respiratory problems. So this is not only felt by those who do work in this type of occupation, but also by people who reside there, who work there, who go to school, who shop, and who go about the business of living in this area of Accra. So when circuit boards are dismantled by hammer and wires are pulled apart by hand, like the third panel that you see here, you can see these like atomized computer parts, like the glass screens and batteries and acrylic resin all around. The particulate matter was like small gold and copper dust clouds of hazardous air. Acrid air from the burning of high-impact thermoplastics were about 200 meters away from this site where this removal was happening. I couldn't help but think of respiration and the way that atomized computer parts get incorporated seemingly into the human body. The labored breathing of this dismantling process, I think, is what Frantz Fanon in The Wretched of the Earth termed combat breathing. A breathing in response to colonial occupation, an occupied breathing that is a bodily contestation of state violence and disregard through this violent arrangement of disposal of waste. Of course, there are other means by which these nearly non-functional electronics could be recycled or disposed of, like through the use of effective microorganisms, or by magnetic and ultrasonic means, or by robotic disassembly. In this case, the waste workers are the doing the disassembly. They are the automation. I should close here now with a hope scenario, like a discussion of Kenyan artist Cyrus Kabiru's series of glasses fabricated out of trash and waste, some of it electronic. Or with a discussion of Tamar Clark Browne's and Isaac Kariuku's installation coding braiding transmissions, where they use GoPro cameras mounted on a headset to creatively question, quote, the potential dynamic between braiding hair and coding as a tool for sending encryptive messages and resistive political action, end quote. We can see from these images Black women braiding each other's hair with the idea that the pattern and motions of the braiding style, of braiding the synthetic human and acrylic hair is captured in some machine-readable way, while the shared intimacies, knowledge, and care of braiding work cannot be truly captured by that technology. Or by Mataluza, the hacker in Saul Williams and Anicia Usman's new film Neptune Forest, as he put it, "My truth is encrypted and yours is easy to read." Of course, Black invention, art, and creativity point to various ways that Black folks trouble the very methodologies of surveillance and insist on making ways of imagining and living beyond an anti-Black surveillance state. To return to M. Norbesi Phillips on algorithmic landscapes and forensic landscapes, she tells us, quote, special tools are necessary to read the silence of the archive, and these tools, to quote Audre Lorde, cannot be the masters. But I do want to turn to a master's tool for a second to think about repair and reparations, that being the U.S. African Growth and Opportunity Act. Abraniwuru is the term used by Ghanaians for the market in dead white men's clothes, used clothing and other textiles that end up in Ghana, Rwanda, and elsewhere. I wonder about the connection between charity clothing drives, fast fashion, the electronic waste trade, and what is sold by the pound to recycling companies to get dumped in Africa, clothing, electronics, and otherwise. We could look at the history and the implementation of the African Growth and Opportunity Act, which has been renewed until 2025, where charity donations, charity in scare quotes, are shipped in bulk to countries in Africa, and where secondhand clothing bans by certain countries are met with restrictions. So products like oil, coffee, diamonds can be imported to the U.S. duty-free or with reduced tariffs. However, any move to increase tariffs on used clothing being dumped there from the U.S. is met with intense pressure from the used clothing lobby, and then retaliation in the form of increased tariffs. When we think of the labor rights of waste workers, so this is around maybe like a $5 a day type of job. So reparations are in order. But any examination into the occupational health and safety risks associated with the exposure to the secondhand consumer electronics market, particularly during the dismantling process, has to take into account the colonial underpinnings of this aspect of the supply chain and contextualize it within the legacy of imperialism and inequities associated with global capitalism. Some questions need to be answered about this garbage imperialism, like who is operating in untraceable ways to get these minerals like copper out of Agabloshi and to build new exactly what technologies? Who are the lobbying industries based in extraction and dumping, and what role, if any, does the African Growth and Opportunity Act play? How is the politics of refusal being enacted by countries that are refusing these garbage dumps? And what role do sending countries, freight shipping companies, and technology producers play here? We must all interrogate this seemingly planned obsolescence of computers, phones, and AirPods that can't be repaired, and encourage invention and innovation in recycling, such as the use of effective microorganisms, a process called bioleaching, where electronic waste is dissolved using bacteria to extract the metals from it. And that is my series of small comments in no particular order on innovations that trouble surveillance and its various technologies, and that are a means of preparation for imagining and living Black life beyond the surveillance state. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Simone. That was so interesting. You covered so many things. I hardly know where to start. Every time I had a question, you answered it in the next 3 or 4 minutes. We have a question. Why don't we start with the question from a viewer who asks whether we see states pushing back on anti-surveillance techniques, such as the use of anti-facial recognition masks.
Whether we see states doing that? Sorry, I didn't see the question.
Yeah, is there pushback on, as people are developing things like masks to defeat facial recognition, are states, or we might broaden it and say, are any civic levels, states, cities, countries pushing back on the attempt to evade facial recognition?
I would say in Canada, there had been not necessarily a reauthorization, but an increased focus on anti-masking acts. And I think Zach Blass's work on facial recognition has discussed that a bit further. And I would suggest that people look to that. But I think that we're in an opportunity now, especially, in the US in particularly, you have the Facial Recognition and Biometrics Technology Moratorium Act that is with the Senate Judiciary Committee right now. And, those questions that I ask about the assumptions that broadening, not Woody Bledsoe, because this was in the 60s, but how we need to take this opportunity to have a more capacious understanding and definition of the possibilities of what facial recognition could do when it comes to the human face. So not just about measurements and planes, but things like DNA, respiration, infrared tech. But what this act also names is not only facial recognition, but they're talking about emotion recognition as well too. Other gait recognition, other ways in which patterns of the body and not necessarily only the face that the federal and the state at the federal and the state level should have some oversight on that. And I think there's also another opportunity with the Office of Science and Technology Policy are having right now a call for, I think it's called RFI, something. So a call for people to annotate and to really bring their expertise and their concerns to the US state around what should happen now with biometrics, not only at the federal and state level, but at the the private level as well too. And so those are at the same time, there might be a push and a pull. There might be a kind of reauthorization of very much Islamophobic acts around anti-Islamophobic acts, Islamophobic acts around failing in spaces like France. But at the it's I think it's just still uneven in which these technologies and the policing of these technologies and the use of them in policing get applied to different communities. And so we have to take these opportunities to bring a multitude of voices into really challenging facial recognition technology and its various manifestations.
It's interesting it is such a push-pull where we have these acts and leaders who are saying we need some regulation of this space, and companies for that matter saying please regulate this space, and yet at the same time I feel like there are those who would respond to some of the concerns. I love your questioning, well, what is a face, right? How do we even measure what is a face, and where does it stop? I can imagine people saying, and I'm not one of these people, but I can imagine people saying, well, that's a technological problem, right? We're just too early in the process, and what we need is we just need to train on more kinds of bodies and more kinds of people, and then everybody will be equal in this kind of surveillance state. And you must encounter that kind of thinking, and I'm wondering what your response is.
I've heard of that thinking. I think I possibly could encounter it. I'm for not only a moratorium, but really questioning what is the use value of these things, and to say that we need more people to be entered into a technology that is overdetermined in how it is used around policing, especially with racialized folks, Black, Brown, and Indigenous folks. I don't think the idea of inclusion or larger training sets or whatever, tech washing kind of way that these technologies and their research and development gets authorized is necessarily the best step. But I think perhaps one way to aside from what I gave you, just to have a politics of stop and refusal and don't necessarily need these things, is also to look at, I guess, what are the intentions around these technologies, and not to say that we need better training, but things like, or better training data, but things to be predictive about something like Parabon that I mentioned, where it's this quite specious claim that a face could be speculated, producing large mugshots from some chewing gum, or like DNA that's found. It's work that I think, and why artists' work is so important is because like the work of Heather Dewey Hagsburg on DNA, with found DNA, has really troubled like the claims that this technology is absolute, a science, and that these could be possibly real faces that criminalize various populations. And so no more like propaganda, no more speculation of all of these things. I think it's time for the folks that and people who are not only who are basically the sites in which these technologies get trained on in the public, that have some insight, but some ways in which they can be in communication and challenge the various manufacturers and researchers and developers, that these things don't happen in a black box, and that technology is not outside of ideas around policing, terrorism, citizenship, the state, and that we all have insight to add and stakes to claim in the development of those things.
There's a couple of questions in the chat, and I'm going to get to them, but you just gave me too good of an entree into a question that I wanted to ask, which is, I love the way that you're incorporating art into your analyses. I have encountered, back to people who think in that way, sometimes I encounter people in social sciences or even humanistic critical sorts of social sciences who just don't know what to make of art. And I would love to hear you speak to why you think art is important, and why it's important to consider art alongside, say, these historical records and documents that you work with. What for you is the value in art as a object of study, other than it's a place where people trouble stuff, which is obviously worthwhile.
It's troubling, but they also anticipate, I think, futures that could be more just and more free than what we have now, and futures around questions of climate disaster and catastrophe as well too. And so in the title of the talk, I had the word blue, and the blue actually comes from two artists. The first is Sable Lee Smith, and it's this work that she does with these large-scale sculptures, like they're about like 14 feet high, made of aluminum, about prison architecture, furniture, and the space of the waiting room. She wants us to think about the very incremental and quotidian and the ways that violence is made ordinary in carceral spaces, the visiting room in which families, loved ones, and others come to meet those that are incarcerated. And why that is the visiting room as a space. If that allows us to think about that space and to get us to a space of imagining and then acting on abolition, to think about, in the last 2 years of COVID and the ways that, visitation has been done now by way of Zoom and other telecommunication companies, and it's said to be convenient. Using the language of Zoom, it's said to be, basically tech washing. And so, at all of these. So I just to say that the moment of that visiting room is important because of, there's a report in The Intercept a couple years ago about voice recognition training being done using incarcerated folks' voices so that's the thing on telecommunication a bit. And the other artist is American artist. And they have a collection of work, some that looks at policing and the thin blue line, the various mythologies and pedagogies of police training. But I would start off first with, and it makes me think of, the colonial underpinnings of what happens when Alexa goes to Accra, what happens when our phones are turned into electronic waste. And I think the title of the work is like, Don't Boil Your iPhone in Coca-Cola. And to get us to think about that dismantling process here, and the ways that perhaps these technologies have a certain planned obsolescence to them. And so yes, I do think that the work that American Artist does on predictive policing, My Blue Window, it's an immersive and interactive piece of, you're basically in a cop car with a screen and all driving around various places in New York. Get us to see that these predictions are just that, based on a particular type of police training that is historically, anti-Black, and also to see that the way cities get immersed in this kind of predictive way. And so I don't know. I just feel like in general the artists do really the heavy lifting, and some of the it's really some of the stuff is really depressing. And there's something about the joy of the possibility of something more that I think that that this work reveals.
I love that. Great answer. Awesome. Let me turn to viewer comments. Kate Crawford asks, thank you for this brilliant talk, Simone. Can you tell us a little bit about if there are forms of solidarity to be found between workers in different strata of information capitalism, and what barriers stand in the way?
I mean, I feel like this is Kate Crawford's work as well too in Atlas of AI.
How handy!
How handy there.
Yeah, my book there too.
And so what are some of the barriers? I think I don't know, right? And so I would first say that I'm a student of the people that are doing organizing work around around labor, around capital, around the environment. And I think that I would hope to see that there's a continuing recognition around fair wages. housing, these things, and to see the kind of transnational connections that can be made. And so rather than thinking about electronic waste work in the Philippines, India, China, Ghana, and other sites, what is happening here around people who are said to be essential workers in basically a factory like Amazon distribution center, and what are my own relations to labor when it comes, and that kind of labor when it comes to that. So maybe I'm not quite sure the barriers, but maybe that's the answer that I have, and to continue to look at the kind of We Won't Build It movement and other folks that are really refusing whistleblowing and calling attention to the kind of uneven and the inequities in when it comes to labor relations and technology or tech.
Thank you. We have a question from Anna Valdivia. Sorry if I said your last name wrong, Anna, from King's College of London, who thanks you so much for this fascinating talk. I think you may have spoken to some of this, but I'm there's a bit here I'm not sure that you have. So nowadays we're witnessing an increasing concern toward biometrics and demographic bias. And as a result, researchers in biometrics are designing systems to identify subjects in a more fair way, avoiding discrimination. And she goes on to ask, given that these systems are implemented in sensitive contexts such as border or asylum applications, do you have any thoughts about a critical approach toward fairness in biometrics? And I know you've said, stop.
It's like, but have they
elaborate on that at all? And Niall Doherty also.
I don't know. I'm sure there's some place, some fantastical place where that's happening, but like, is it really being done in a fair and isn't fair something that is like socially produced and understood as like who is fair? And I know that there was years ago, and perhaps still now, there was a pilot project out of the UK that was using DNA around asylum seekers to differentiate asylum seekers from Kenya, from Somalia, and we know that that DNA is not a nationalizing technology, but when we have these types of projects that produce it as such, as producing certain truths about citizenship, birth, whatever it is, then it gets authorized just as such. So I don't know if those. I mean, should we have borders? To be honest, like I don't know.
Oh, now you're gonna get really radical.
States, be fair. I don't know. I do appreciate that question, but I think for me, it's especially now, especially as we see with quite intensive changes in climate, and people move and should have rights to do so. The question of how borders, and I think it maybe at the beginning of my talk when the Canadian minister held up this card, which won awards as the most secure card in the world, but it got authorized by saying that the Canada border has to be protected from Sri Lankans, basically with that imagery. And so in many ways that this idea around states, borders is racist, and we'll have to contend with this a lot more when we see that people are on the move even more because of climate devastation and catastrophe.
So Niall Doherty thanks you for an amazing talk, and I think it follows up. He's thinking about the tension of the socially constructed configurations of the body being made measurable through computation, and he's wondering if you think there's ever a way for measurement to be inclusive, and in particular, perhaps as this relates to something like precision medicine or healthcare.
And even something as important as I have so many of them, those oximeters that I bought at the time. I had to use it once, and it had nothing to do with COVID, but mixing cleaning products. Anyways, that's an aside. When I was looking at these documents from Woody Bledsoe in the 60s or so, and why I highlighted it when I mentioned it to you all in the talk, is when he talked about this wide set nose. knows. And that is, you know, the language of cop speak, you know, how power gets, you know, rationalized and gets made through language, is saying things like the wide set knows. And that same phrasing, you know, came up in 2016 when Philando Castile was killed by a cop, and said, you know, they look like the suspect we were looking for because of the wide set nose. And so can bodies be measured in some equitable way? Why do bodies need to be measured, like outside of like, you know, bertionnage and colonial management, say fingerprints in India at the time of a British occupation and a colonization of that space? Is there, I just don't see, like, what is the use value for all of this measurement? And should we have other ways? Do people need to be measured against something or each other? I think those are the questions. I'm not like a social theorist, and I don't really have, you know, sometimes I might have some policy concerns, but my question is like, why measurement is, you know, necessary, especially when we know, you know, the histories and the present that these kinds of measures uphold and come out of.
Yeah, it's so hard to back off measurement once there's a technique with which to measure.
Because we don't want to lose it, all that work, you know.
Like, but there's a number, and it's getting higher.
Yeah, I can use and stuff.
Yeah, Paula, who doesn't leave a last name, says, so much new information for me. Thank you. What has surprised you most from your research, and what has been most validated from your research?
Oh, that's a good question, and I probably don't have I probably think of some answer in a bit. What surprised me most is that, like, it's the changing same. If we just look at like facial recognition technology, this was like the same stuff that was coming out of R&D in, you know, research that I was reading in the early 2000s, with the same type of really archaic language around race, around physiology, and whatever other types of et ceteras of scientific racism, and that it continues today. And so this was something that was seen coming, was known that this was, and how it got authorized maybe 30, 20 years later, and what it will do in the future, that is surprising. I think another thing that's been interesting is even the challenges to these technologies. I mean, I studied branding and enslavement and the afterlife of it, but to think about how, and the branding of biometric technologies in films and other kinds of, you know, product placement, but to think even that the contesting of these technologies to get heard needs to be branded as well. And it speaks a lot to the kind of capitalist system in which we live in. So that's actually been my surprise, that I actually don't mention that. But like I should have saw it coming. Like, you know, you got to brand your critique some way, make it legible.
Yeah, right. If it's not TikTok friendly, forget about it.
Yes.
Let me pose what's probably a last question, and I'm sorry not to have gotten to everybody's question, from Jade Davis, former MSR intern. Hi, Jade. Jade says,
I know Jade.
You know Jade?
Yes.
Jade's best. We all love Jade. Jade says, thank you, Simone. This was wonderful. For those of us who are in positions to teach or run workshops to help young adults critically engage with these ideas, have you seen any artistic interventions that are easily doable outside of boiling iPhones in Coca-Cola with a group of students? Teaching tips in general.
Okay, so I might have to think about that one, but I do, and I learned some of this from the folks at Deep Lab. I think some of them are on the talk, but these speed projects that I do with my class, to have them do some type of speculative thinking around technology, around an app, around, you know, Black Mirror, or those kinds of things that could be done in the short time frame in a class, to get them to think about the social implications of these texts. What could be the terms of service, possibly? What could be the possible harms and outcomes? And you know, who is being not included in these technologies? And I think that's one way in which I've, at least in the classroom, to have students think speculatively, but also in concrete ways that they could imagine a future different than you know, the technologies that we have now.
Yeah, it's interesting. I see people turning more and more to speculative future projects to try and break out of our ways of thinking. We have 60 seconds left, and I want to, there's some good questions here, and I wish we could keep on going, but we are coming up on the end of the hour, so I'm afraid we're going to have to let these lie. Thank you for watching. Thank you for asking questions. Thank you for your engagement, and thank you, Simone, for an amazing and provocative talk. That it's so interesting the way that I was back channeling with you during it, the way that you echo a lot of themes that have been coming up in the talks already that we've heard, and in some that are yet to come. Eleanor Buxton has left in the live Q&A chat reminder that the recording for this talk is going to be available. So if you love it and you're sad that your friends missed it, you're going to be able to point them to it later on. And we have a bunch of speakers coming up in the series yet. We're going all the way through June, so even more awesomeness to come. November 17th, we will have Andre Brock from the University of Georgia, who's got a fantastic book called Digital Blackness, which is racking up awards left and right. And he's a super fun speaker, so we're really looking forward to that. And a reminder also that the past talks from folks like, I'm going to forget somebody's name if I start naming them, but they're all amazing and they're all there for your viewing. So send your friends, send your students, send your colleagues, send everybody. And we'll see you November 17th. And thank you again so much, Simone.
Thank you, Nancy. And thank you, everyone. This has been great, Microsoft. Thank you.
Our pleasure, our honor. Thank you.